Hi everyone, thanks for joining us in Grand Challenge number 1 related to addressing injustice in the built environment. Apologies for my tardiness, I got a little lost in the food court. And I'm going to give a quick kind of overall intro into the Grand Challenge and kind of what it is and where it's coming from. And then we have 4 presentations today, and then the presentation should run sort of 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll have some time for sort of discussion and Q&A. Hopefully we can make this a pretty kind of informal conversation. My name is Jonathan Crisman. I'm Assistant Professor in Public and Applied Humanities in the College of Humanities here at the university. And I'm joined by Arlie Adkins, Assistant Professor in CAPLA, Lad Keith, Assistant Professor in CAPLA, and Robin Reineke. Assistant Research Social Scientist in Anthropology in the Southwest Center here at the university. So I'm really excited to see what they have to present. It's a pretty diverse range of topics, all related to this issue. So right now, it's a little bit of a work in progress, but the way the Grand Challenge has been worded as of now in relation to the overall RESTRUCT initiative, Grand Challenge number 1 is Redress, Inequality / Injustice in Re-envisioning the Built Environment. Lots of re's appropriate for our restructing. But what does this mean more specifically? I actually like to think about this more broadly as the idea of spatial justice. So Ed Soja, the late geographer and urban planner, wrote a wonderful book called Seeking Spatial Justice. And in it, he writes, the geography or spatiality of justice is an integral and formative component of justice itself, a vital part of how justice and injustice are socially constructed and evolve over time. So a lot of times when we think about justice and injustice, it's often thought about socially or more abstractly, not necessarily sort of kind of manifesting in the built environment on the ground in space around us. And I think what Soja is pointing out is that it's really important to kind of think about the way in which justice and injustice manifest spatially. And in fact, more than it just being a kind of register through which we can identify justice or injustice, it's actually a kind of a space in which justice itself can be constructed. So, what do we mean by that? This is a map of air pollution in Chicago. So there are any number of kind of examples of spatial injustice that we might talk about, but this is sort of one such example that it just so happens that the air pollution patterns in the city of Chicago are highly concentrated around Chicago's south side, which of course is also where it's predominantly African American, there's more poverty, and so sort of these kind of coincident phenomena are not an accident. These are actually a kind of result of the way in which we built our environment and the way in which over time different kinds of facilities, power plants, and so on get sort of situated in the built environment. Sort of the geography or the distribution of things like pollution or accessibility to things like healthy food are often we can see through a kind of spatial justice lens. And so that's really kind of broadly thinking sort of what this Grand Challenge is. How do we leverage our built environment research to really kind of centrally incorporate the question of justice and sort of distribution of sort of access or distribution of negative externalities like air pollution in a way that creates justice and is more kind of equitable for everyone. So that's, we can, I took off my name tag, but if you take out your little card, you can see some of the specific areas in which, again, this is sort of like a work in progress, but a number of areas in which the RESTRUCT campaign is thinking about redressing inequality spatially. So just broadly, redressing inequality and justice through the built environment, guaranteeing equality and justice in human-environment interaction. So this is things like access to housing, for example. Provide equitable interior urban spaces. to meet basic human conditions. This is all housing. The equality and justice, perhaps that's more closely related to something like the air pollution I was talking about earlier. And finally, accessibility and connectedness. So this is things like universal design, or the idea that we might actually design our built environment so that it's accessible to all people, regardless of age or ability, et cetera. So these are just some preliminary thoughts on ways in which this grand challenge might be kind of constructed and addressed in our research here at the University of Arizona. But it's a very broad category, and I think I'm really happy to see that it's sort of grand challenge number one in the overall initiative, because I think this is really a central piece that ought to manifest in every single one of the research projects that we're doing related to the built environment. How is our research actually producing spatial justice or injustice, and how do we kind of move the needle toward justice? I'm going to present one quick example of what we're up to so far through RESTRUCT, and then we'll go into the presentations. The RESTRUCT initiative has given out a number of seed grants to research projects on campus, and one of the seed grants was really geared toward this first grand challenge. This is a sort of a set of bullet points provided by the PI, Adriana Zwinga, who's in CAPLA. She's an assistant research professor there. And this is really a seed grant which created a pilot program for mentoring high school students in South Tucson with regard to green infrastructure. So the funds were used to hire University of Arizona undergrad students as interns who worked with these high school students in setting up an after-school program. And they worked together to collaboratively design a landscape for their high school, which thought about green infrastructure and water use. And ultimately, they had a kind of launch day where 32 volunteers came. They implemented the project planted trees, and concluded with a celebration. Actually recognized the high school students who were participating, giving them kind of certificates for participating in the Green Club. So that's kind of one example. Again, this is sort of a small sort of test case or seed kind of pilot of something that might scale up over time. So Adriana sends her regards. She'll be presenting in one of the afternoon sessions, but can't be here today. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to our first presentation, who I can't remember, is it Arlie or Lad? Lad, yeah.
Do you want to switch the
yeah.
PowerPoint?
I'll do that, and then I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Lad Keith, and I'm an assistant professor in planning. And because it's dead day at the end of the semester, I'm going to use my laptop also, because there's no way I can remember this. So I research climate action planning for cities. And what I look at is how cities and the planning profession is looking at climate change and both trying to adapt to its impacts and to mitigate further contributions through greenhouse gases. So I've done some work with comprehensive plans and interviewing planners across the country. And one of the things that's emerged from that, that's kind of led me to this topic, is there's a lot of different impacts from climate change affecting cities, sea level rise, flooding, wildfires. One of the ones that has had less attention until recently is extreme heat and kind of how cities are dealing with extreme heat, urban heat island. So that's kind of, my previous work has led me to this topic. And extreme heat is a relevant and increasing climate risk. 128 million people in the United States were under excessive heat wave warnings during the summer's heat wave. And as you can see, that spatially about 2/3 of the country was covered under that. And that was the first time that the NWS had issued a warning that severe for that much of the population. And locally, it's a very relevant climate impact as well. So Tucson is the third fastest warming city in the United States, and has experienced its second hottest summer on record in 2019. And kind of if you look at the records, every year is hotter than the last, and so the last 10 have been up in the hottest ever that we've experienced. So definitely a national impact that we should be looking at, and one that's locally very relevant too. But it's one that doesn't get a lot of attention because it can be harder to talk about than some of the other climate risks. So as you can kind of see in the picture back here, unlike the more dramatic images you might see after wildfire or after flooding, a lot of times the before the heat wave looks exactly like after the heat wave in the built environment. And so this is really where that climate justice part of the talk comes in, because it's not so much the built environment necessarily that's impacted, but it's the people. And so we want to look at the people that are impacted. So there are documented impacts from extreme heat that we should care about in the built environment. So it's actually the #1 deadliest climate impact above hurricanes and wildfires and everything else. So heat is the #1 killer. But beyond that, we also care about people's quality of life. And if you're in Tucson, if you're from the Southwest, if you have children, if you grew up here, kind of the idea that we want our children to be able to go outside and play. We want to encourage people to have healthy lifestyles. We also want to encourage people to live in walkable downtowns and walkable neighborhoods. And so all of those things are impacted as cities increasingly get hotter. There's also economic impacts. Research has shown that as it continues to get hotter and during heat waves, there's decreased economic productivity in a lot of places. Energy and water concerns, infrastructure and urban systems, the urban ecology that we're planting now might not be appropriate, and there's research showing that the landscapes that we're planting now aren't thriving because we're using plants that were for the historic past climate, not the one that's currently occurring or the future one. And then again, that idea of if we want to get people out of cars and mitigate greenhouse gases that way and increase public health outcomes, that as things get hotter, it's going to be more difficult to encourage people to do bicycling or use transportation. So there's two main contributors to extreme heat that we think about. So one is climate change, of course, and the average annual temperature has already increased 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 3 decades. And that's projected to increase 3 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. The reason that I have the 12 degrees bolded a little bit more is that if you've been paying attention to the IPCC and the national talks about kind of where we're going internationally about mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions, we're not doing as much as we should, and we're definitely headed towards the worst case scenarios. So we're looking probably more like the 12 degrees Fahrenheit increases. And that means an increase in duration, frequency, and extremes of heat waves. And this is just a little graph that shows even with a slight increase of temperatures, we actually get much more on the tail end with extreme hot weather. So the types of summers that we've been seeing recently are going to kind of increase in frequency, and places that have never dealt with heat waves are going to be thinking more about them in the future. But more than that, we also have the urban heat island effect. So kind of thinking about both climate change and the urban heat island, which many of you probably know, but the urban heat island is basically the way that we've built our cities, generates and retains heat, and can be as much as 22 degrees difference between the center of the city and the rural or kind of countryside areas. So that changes across the country, depends on the geography and the environment, but that impact can be as much as 22 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's lots of different factors that impact that. I won't go into those too much, but the basic idea is that when you have more built environment, more paved surfaces, less vegetation, those places are hotter than the places that have those things. So UHI can be a tricky thing to talk about though, because that might lead you to think that everyone should live in suburban, sprawling, rural places with big yards. And actually research has shown that the spatial size of the urban area also contributes to the UHI. So it's not just the dense downtowns, it's also all of those large lots with the vegetation too. And so we don't want to come to the conclusion that we should get rid of downtowns or dense areas, because those can be designed properly to mitigate the UHI that they contribute to. So kind of tying it all back to climate justice before we talk about a couple of projects, and I have my GRA Tess Wagner here to talk about a case study project that we did. So some considerations for climate, extreme heat as a climate justice issue. So Jonathan kind of set this up nicely, but there's a very definite spatial component to the extreme heat risk, and this is a map that we created with CLEMIS on campus, and Ben McMahan at CLEMIS was one of the map creators of the Tucson area's UHI from 2018. So this is just a snapshot of one day from last summer. And you can see just, if you're familiar with Tucson at all, I don't know if this has a, nope, I turned it off. Okay, let's not do that again. So this does not have a laser pointer. But if you're familiar with Tucson, you can see kind of the bluer area toward the top is cooler. That's the foothills, the mountain range. Midtown is kind of the yellowish area. And as you go further south to the south side, more Hispanic, lower income, it's absolutely kind of the darker orange, hotter color. So Tucson's a good example of this, but if you look at any city across the country, there's definitely a spatial component to UHI. Part of it's because when you have more rental units and maybe less home ownership, there may be less maintenance and landscaping going on, but then also landscaping is expensive to do, and the richer areas tend to be better at convincing the government that they need to landscape those better areas better too. So. It's also the exposure of individuals and communities, and then compounding vulnerabilities that we think about with extreme heat. So things like outdoor workers, the homeless population, if you're forced to use public transportation even on extremely hot days and you can't make that switch to automobiles or other modes of transportation. So things like that we want to think about. And then also, if you have lower income and you might have less health insurance and less access to health care, those things will put you at higher risk too. We want to think about who has influence over actions to reduce their risk. And so again, the folks that can upgrade to get ACs when it gets hotter in more temperate cities like New York City or in the Northeast or the Midwest. And then those people that can kind of complain and have the wherewithal to get their government to install street trees when they feel like they need it. So those are things that we want to think about. And then also something Tess will mention is not just peoples and individuals and communities, but cities themselves and thinking them as a unit that might have a climate justice component. And some of the smaller, more rural communities or the poor communities as a whole may be less connected to universities, less access to resources, and those cities as a whole might have less ability to adapt to extreme heat. So kind of going from that as the background, I've partnered with Sarah Miro up at ASU, and we just have a paper under review looking at planning for extreme heat. And so this is one of the first papers kind of looking at extreme heat from a planning lens. And some of our questions that we wanted answered were, what are the trends in peer-reviewed literature related to planning for extreme heat? What are the barriers to increase resilience? And kind of what are the next steps? So to do this, we looked at all papers up to 2018 with urban heat, extreme heat, and planning in the title or abstract, and came up with a data set of 589 papers, and then reviewed those more in depth and came up with 39 that really truly focused on kind of planning issues for extreme heat. And as you can see here, just a little graph showing there has definitely been a major uptick in the interest in extreme heat as a planning issue. So you can just see the last 60% of the papers published were in the last 5 years. So that's definitely been a growing topic. But if you look kind of more importantly, the thing I care more about on the percentages, 70% of those papers are kind of the modeling of UHI, so looking at it as a phenomenon, and then 14% are looking kind of at the landscape architecture, maybe design components of how we can respond to it. Only 7% of those papers were looking at the planning or governance aspects of extreme heat. So kind of as this topic continues to emerge, we need to not only figure out how to map it and how to design for it, but how to actually plan for it and govern for it too. So just a couple of the takeaways that we found. Strategies for extreme heat planning kind of fell into two major categories. One was risk management with things like emergency response and preparedness and warning systems. And then another was the design of the built environment category, which again looked at things like increasing vegetation, looking at buildings and urban infrastructure, and then changes in land use and urban form to mitigate for extreme heat. And then a lot of the complications we looked at were things regarding co-benefits, trade-offs, and maladaptations. And again, I'll go over this really quickly, but co-benefits is the idea in climate adaptation that something like green infrastructure might reduce flooding because it's taking water off the road, but then it also might increase vegetation and decrease the urban heat island effect. So that would be something that has multiple benefits that we would want to look at. Trade-offs are things like I've worked with New York City quite a bit on the extreme heat topic, and they are looking at providing lower income residences with more air conditioning. but they're very aware that there's an energy trade-off with that. So they want to help them have a safe environment in their indoor with the air quality and the air temperature. But by doing that, they increase the energy usage, which puts them further away from meeting their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one of those trade-off things that they're looking at. And then maladaptations would be something like the city of Los Angeles, potentially, where they did an experiment and painted some of the streets reflective painting. And the idea was that it would reflect the temperature, make it cooler, and kind of reduce the UHI effect. And if anybody who's lived in the desert knows, when you're next to a reflective surface like this, it reflects the light back right onto you. And so they've actually done studies since then that shows that the sidewalks are now 20 degrees hotter in these areas for pedestrians, and the buildings use 35 to 40% more energy at some points. So again, that would be something like a maladaptation, because it's probably an adaptation action that we don't want to take because it has so many negative consequences. But again, we have to kind of experiment and see which of these work and which of these don't work as we go forward. So some challenges identified in this particular paper that we looked at, and again, this was looking at those 39 papers that truly focused on planning and governance for extreme heat. There's an absolute lack of legal governance structures for extreme heat planning, which again makes sense because it's kind of a newer topic that we're looking at. But if you combine it with flooding, we have floodplain managers, we have a national FEMA system, we have floodplain insurance. There's nothing similar set up for extreme heat. So it's on a different, definitely a different type of climate risk because there's a lack of precedent for it. There's siloed research and practice efforts that limit collaboration and learning opportunities. So there's a lot of public health papers on it, maybe a couple planning papers on it, a couple of landscape architecture papers on it. We're all doing things in silos but not talking to each other, so we keep relearning the same lessons and not really sharing what we're working on. And then there's a lack of coordination and implementation of both the risk management and design strategies. So again, the public health folks may be looking at reducing risk of the human side, and then the planners and designers might be looking at reducing UHI, but we're not doing a good job of talking and meeting in the middle to maybe have those public health outcomes kind of influence how we're designing the built environment. There's complex context-specific and diverse heat resilient strategies, and they're almost always for a specific city or a specific neighborhood or a specific site, and so it's hard to get that information out there for a broader audience. And then there's also a need for more multidisciplinary data and tools. And then most of the papers did acknowledge vulnerabilities, kind of, again, that climate justice component, but a lot more research is needed to improve resilience for those most at risk. So the papers are kind of acknowledging that it's out there, but they're not saying how we can actually improve the outcomes for those people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tess Wagner, who's going to talk about a NOAA-funded project that we worked on with Clisman here, looking at case studies for how cities in Arizona and New Mexico are using their urban heat island maps that they have. So Tess?
All right, so hi everyone. As Lad mentioned, we've been looking at how heat maps are used in Arizona and New Mexico. So there are two main parts to this project. The first part, we wanted to look at and document how communities in the US in the Southwest are using urban heat maps. And then the second part was to work with pilot communities to examine challenges and opportunities in using extreme heat maps. For the first part, we identified all the communities in New Mexico and Arizona that had a population above 30,000. So this was 44 communities in total, and we reached out to them to determine if they have used an urban heat island map for any planning activities, if they know if one exists, and those sorts of things. And then for the second part of the project, we, through our scoping interviews, we identified communities that didn't have urban heat maps but were interested in them. So we identified 4 communities and worked with them iteratively to create urban heat island maps for them, and that's an ongoing project. So within determining which communities had urban heat island maps and were using them, we found 4 communities, Tucson, Phoenix in Arizona, and then Las Cruces and Albuquerque in New Mexico. And there were some commonalities between these and then some big differences. So Tucson, Las Cruces, and Albuquerque, all of these maps were based on aerial imagery. So using satellite-derived land surface temperatures as a proxy for on the ground what's being experienced in terms of heat. These maps, all 3 of them, are available online publicly, so anybody can access them. And then the Phoenix maps are a little bit of a different case. They do not have one that's publicly accessible, but the city works closely with Arizona State University. They have a close relationship, so they're actually able to develop maps kind of on a case-by-case situation. So this map in the lower right-hand corner is actually a map of bus stop temperatures in the Phoenix area. So they actually set out temperature sensors at the different bus stops and were able to get a really accurate representation of which bus stops were hot, which ones were okay, and looking at the hotter ones, they were able to prioritize tree plantings to provide shade for these areas. So there were several takeaways that we took from this project. We found that the communities in general had a lot of questions and concerns about the accuracy and reliability of the maps. So this is in part because satellite-derived temperatures are not necessarily what is being experienced on the ground. And then also there's the issue of resolution and the issue of how the urban heat island effect changes throughout the day, throughout the year. So if you have one snapshot, how can that be representative of a whole bunch of different times of the year? So this gets to the point that there's a lack of map updates for these communities. So some of them were working off of satellite imagery that's several years old, maybe up to a decade at this point. So, there have been urban changes as well. There's been construction and changes in land cover. So there are areas of the map that probably aren't very representative of what's really happening right now. We also found that there's inconsistent buy-in and use from departments within the cities and the different communities. So a lot of times there was kind of a lack of communication between different departments, and some that may find the map useful did not know it existed or didn't know how to use it or that sort of thing. And then kind of another, in the same thread, there's a lack of connection between different communities who are using these resources. So they haven't been able to talk with each other and kind of work out and share with each other what they've learned from using these urban heat maps and kind of having that knowledge shared amongst them. And then we also found that the public availability of the maps allowed for some creative and unanticipated uses. So in Tucson, one example of that is the Pima County Public Library System actually looked at the urban heat map to determine which libraries were in higher heat areas and then should be prioritized for green infrastructure plantings. So that's kind of an interesting use and something that happens when you have these maps that are publicly available. So moving on to the second part of the project, these were the 4 communities that Ben developed urban heat island maps for, and this is an example of the map developed for Avondale. So the communities were Santa Fe and Dona Ana County in New Mexico, and then Avondale and Buckeye in Arizona. And this is ongoing, so we've distributed the maps to them, and then we're working iteratively to determine what questions they have, what could make the maps more useful to them, and that sort of thing. And then something that kind of came out of that was this extreme heat network, which is something that we created to connect practitioners and researchers involved with extreme heat, because we did identify that as a pretty big barrier to actually working with these issues and figuring out what to do about them. So we started a webinar series. We've had several speakers speaking about different aspects of managing urban heat in the real world. So there was one who spoke about citizen science, We had another speak about health, and then we had another speak about actual creation of urban heat island maps. So that gives people the opportunity to kind of come together and see who else is working on similar issues. So, yeah, so I'll hand it back to Lad now.
Thank you, Tess.
Yeah.
Last slide, and then we'll turn it over to our other speakers for this morning. Thank you. So just kind of where we're at right now is the results from a couple of the different heat projects we've worked on. I was the science contributor and reviewer for the Urban Land Institute's Scorched report on extreme heat in real estate. So the real estate industry is really looking at this as a topic they care about. We did a webinar to launch it, and they had like over 600 people attend it. So it was their most highly attended webinar series they've ever had, they said. And it's been downloaded thousands of times. So that's been something that our research and the case studies that Tess and I worked on contributed. And then we've also been working with the Trust for Public Land, who just recently launched UHI maps to 14,000 cities in the United States. So it's the first time that this information's been available on that wide of a spectrum. And so we've been helping them with some of the lessons we've learned from distributing our own urban heat island maps about their appropriate use and their limitations, importantly, because there are a lot of limitations with using them. Again, we have the Extreme Heat Network that we launched, that's ongoing. And we're also partnering with the WRRC, the Water Resource Research Center on campus, on incorporating extreme heat into NOAA's environmental literacy program. And then currently with Sarah Miro, again at Arizona State University, we're conducting a nationwide survey of urban planners on extreme heat risk perceptions, actions, and information needs. And with that information, we're hoping to go forward and inform both NOAA on kind of their ongoing work on extreme heat, but then also probably come up with an NSF grant proposal to move a larger project forward, looking at how we can actually advance the governance for extreme heat in the United States. So, thank you again, and I think we'll turn it over to the next speakers, right? So, thank you.
My name is Reineke. I'm an assistant research social scientist at the Southwest Center, which is an interdisciplinary research center focused on the greater Southwest and northern Mexico. And this is really hard to squeeze. Okay. I am a sociocultural and forensic anthropologist, and I've worked for 13 to 14 years on forensics along the US-Mexico border. And the way that I do forensics is both traditional skeletal forensic anthropology, but also forensic architecture, and using the forensic gaze and considering evidence on a much larger scale. So just to kind of frame how I'm thinking about forensics in my project, which is called Border FORENSIS. It's both at the individual case level, so if you imagine a traditional forensic anthropologist examining one skeletal case, yes, that level of analysis, which is one practitioner looking at one individual case, but then it's also expanding the gaze much broader through both space and time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Border FORENSIS project today, which I'm tying into the built environment discussion, especially thinking through ways that we can re-envision history. So the ways in which we can bring things into view that might be eclipsed by a particular disciplinary focus or a particular temporal or spatial focus. So those are the ways that is this working? Oh, it is, okay, great. So Border FORENSIS takes theoretical inspiration from a theoretical architect, A.L. Weissman, who has developed the forensic architecture program out of Goldsmiths University in London. It's a fascinating and really important project that's bringing together a number of different disciplines, looking at the ways in which space, the built environment, are utilized for often military control, for strategic control of movement in especially urban spaces, but also what he calls frontier zones, which are these spaces that are sort of contested and outside of kind of traditional sovereign territories where there's some sort of contested boundary maintenance going on. So just a couple of important notes from Weissman's work. It's kind of a counter-forensic, so that's one way of looking at this different scope, from the individual case level kind of to broader, looking at maybe 100,000 cases. Forensics, it's creating a forensics that's capable of examining three-dimensional spaces, so not just one case or one plane, but the three-dimensional space of built environment, which also includes how the built environment interacts with a local ecology, which I'm especially going to get into in this talk. Specifically, this kind of forensic architectural approach is really helpful for frontier zones as opposed to urban zones, because in these spaces of frontier zones, matter becomes the apparatus with which warfare is conducted. So the strategy really depends on the built environment. It depends on the use of the local ecology. So what Border Patrol is doing in terms of how the local ecology and the local terrain is used tactically, we can kind of put that into better view by looking specifically at the architecture, the decisions made about the use of the space. So turning space into evidence. This is a long quote, I apologize. It's also in all caps, which is terrible. I just couldn't manage to change that. So just bear with me. No need to read it, I will read it for you. So just again, framing the talk, for forensic architecture, buildings are not just passive elements, they're not just receptive sensors on which events are registered, nor are they just the scenes of a crime, the locations in which violence takes place. Rather, built environments are composite assemblages of structures, spaces, infrastructures, services, and technologies with the capacity to act and interact with their surroundings and to shape events around them. So they can structure and condition rather than simply frame human action. They actively and sometimes violently shape incidents and events. So here in terms of RESTRUCT, I've been thinking about this kind of playful term RESTRUCT and re-envision. What I'm restructing or reconstructing is the space between killer and victim, the space between policymaker and the person impacted by that policy. Processes that have unfolded over larger amounts of space and time, so where your distance between killer and victim is much farther. The events, the sequence of events in the crime, I'm playing with lens. What are we including in the photographic lens and what are we excluding? And looking at evidence of violence in a multitude of ways, so on the bodies, on the species, on the landscape, indigenous peoples, etc. So it's also importantly, the Border FORENSIS project that I'm building and I'm excited to talk with you guys about, and it's really critical to shift the gaze that's not just managed by one epistemological lens. So we need to bring together architects, forensic anthropologists, geographers, linguists. One of the scary things about atrocity is where bureaucratic roles become very separate from one another. And so this is one of the ways in which violence, and I'm taking this idea from Zygmunt Bauman, who studied modernity and the Holocaust in bureaucracy, and the way in which the more that little roles can become separated from one another, it's yet another place where violence disappears, and it's easier for states to effect violence without accountability and to make it look like it's normal. Okay, so that's the theoretical lens. What is prevention through deterrence? So the title of my talk is Prevention Through Deterrence, the Uses and Abuses of the Built Environment. And I'm actually really much more focused on the abuses in this context, because I do think that if you look at the history and the spatial history of prevention through deterrence, it's been an entirely very deeply violent and destructive process. So prevention through deterrence is the language of the US federal state, and actually predates Trump, but predates even DHS. It was a strategy that was coined and developed under the Clinton administration, actually in collaboration with the Center for Low Intensity Conflict. And it was a theory, it was built on this theory that the more the costs increase, whether cost of life or injury or expense for people to cross the border, the fewer people would make the attempt. Well, that was the theory starting in the mid-90s. So right around 1994, this became the dominant US federal strategy for border enforcement. And we saw prevention through deterrence be cited again as explanation for abusive and violent practices in the practice of the Trump administration in separating families. And 3 Trump administration officials actually said prevention through deterrence by name: Kirstjen Nielsen, Trump, and Sessions. But this is not a new strategy. In fact, it was baked into the 1994 Border Patrol Strategic Plan. And this is a image from that plan, which you can find online. And this is a really important piece of evidence and historic document. And what you can see here, so this is the 94 Border Patrol Strategic Plan under Clinton, signed by Doris Meisner, acting head of INS, which predated DHS. And what they're doing here is they're mapping out how they're going to use the natural environment as part of their strategy for the control of mobility along the border. And so what prevention through deterrence effectively did is it used the geography of the borderlands as part of the weaponization and militarization of the wall. So there were places where walls were put in where they weren't existing before. Mainly those were urban areas. They were places where people were kind of going under the fence, running across highways. This was how labor from Latin America was imported to the United States in an undocumented form, which was uniquely exploitable for large agribusiness. So this was a previously structured built environment that was people coming across, doing seasonal migration and returning south based on a circular seasonal flow. What this did is it disrupted that, and it put walls in those areas where people were historically used to coming across, and it funneled people into the desert, Sonoran Desert, and Texas remote desert ranch lands. We'll return to that. Just some pretty fascinating language from this strategy. These are just screenshots from that 94 Border Patrol Strategic Plan signed by Meisner. Under assumptions, it lists violence will increase as effects of strategy are felt. So that was, when you're creating a strategic plan and you include, okay, we know one of our measures of success is that violence will increase. That's a pretty interesting assumption. It also states illegal entrants crossing through remote, uninhabited expanses of land and sea along the border can find themselves in mortal danger. So, it says throughout the document, they're using heat, they're using mountains, they're using remote geography as an arm of control on the border. So it's difficult for me to agree at this point that the loss of life that we saw as a result of these policies was simply accidental. Also, we've had now more than 20 years to address that and to restruct something that was less deadly and actually more secure. This is a map that's far too detailed to see on this slide. I just wanted to share it with you in case you're interested in kind of following up more. Kenneth Madsen at Ohio State University has created some really wonderful, useful maps showing the history of exactly which segments of the wall were enforced when and which laws had to be waived in order for that portion of the wall to be built. In southern Arizona, essentially what happened and what you can see here and what you can see in the Prevention Through Deterrence plan, of course, is that the portions that were a little bit more immediately passable along the international boundary led you straight into the heart of the Sonoran Desert, the most remote and dangerous landscape in the country. Some of the most remote and dangerous landscape in the country. So I'm just gonna kind of depart here and do something a little bit creative. I spent some time doing a water drop this summer down at Organ Pipe, which is the area where border wall is being actively right now built by the Trump administration, bulldozing cactus and saguaro and sacred sites by the Tohono O'odham sites. And I spent time there and I photographed, okay, what does this actually look like? What are the material impacts of this ideology and this policy? So just because I don't think we actually look at it enough. What does it mean when we say a wall? What does that actually mean? Well, what I want to talk about is it's actually layers of wall. It's called defense in depth. And this is a Border Patrol strategy. It's not just a wall, but it's actually, at times, up to like 15 layers of surveillance and control. And all of this, again, it gets back to controlling the flow of movement through a space. So it's not necessarily stopping it, it's controlling it. And I think looking intimately at the material manifestations of this make that clear. Okay, so the photograph on the left, this is relatively recent portions of the wall in organ pipe. On the right, older, like 2012 era, Obama administration era bollard fencing. And then this is Normandy barriers, vehicle blockades on the left in organ pipe. And right now what's happening is the Trump administration wants to add another layer to that and go ahead and build similar wall to the previous image along this entire space where it's only bollard wall. I mean, it's only these Normandy barriers. Now, the Normandy barriers are important, an important alternative to the other two types of wall for wildlife. So this is a major migration wildlife corridor, and this allows animals to migrate and mate, and it increases, allows species diversity to continue despite this disruptive presence of a wall. When you look closer, there's yet another barrier, another layer of wall in the barbed wire. And there's hundreds of thousands of feet of barbed wire and now razor wire along the wall as well. And this causes impact to species as well as human beings, to animals as well as human beings. Okay, this is another area. So you can see here actually, there's the old wall, the old international boundary wall behind the newer construction, and then yet another layer here in razor wire. And now keep in mind that this kind of razor wire has actually been, it's considered inhumane for use with livestock. So there's huge use of the types of technologies and materials that actually wouldn't be allowed to be used even on a farm control landscape that are now being used along the border. So this is the National Guard recently installing razor wire in Nogales. And I want to point to one aspect of this technique that's interesting, which is stacked functions. So what we see here is not only this claimed use of razor wire and wall to stop migration, but you also have a performative impact. So you have a striking visual of control, of power, of violence. It also changes life a little bit for people who, or a lot for people who live in that area. It changes the wall into a multi-dimensional space where power is being negotiated. This type of wall, the top, people coming over the top will sever limbs and fingers, and falling from the wall can cause very serious injuries, decapitations, etc. Another layer, Normandy barriers on top of the 2 or 3 existing layers here. This is a surveillance technique used by Border Patrol, so it's dragging for sign. So in between the wall, it's another layer, so in between the wall you have like the road where Border Patrol will drive, and then they'll drag these tires so that footprints can be visible if someone tries to cross. This is a ground sensing radar, so if you make a noise or stomp near that, Border Patrol will show up really quickly. This is all in one day. All of these photographs are taken in one day. This is Border Patrol very close to Quito Baquito Springs, which is where a lot of the current infrastructure is being built. This is another important aspect, another layer, so you're getting further in. These are really interesting signs. I don't know if you can read them very well, but caution, smuggling and or illegal immigration are common in this area. So notice that it's in English, and also it's posted right next to Africanized bees warning. So it's a pretty dehumanizing warning, and you can tell who the audience is because it's not translated. You also have this note here. Now this is Organ Pipe National Monument official signage for tourists, again in English. It says cross-border incursions occur. If you encounter someone or a group traveling with backpacks, bundles, or black water bottles, do not make contact. Report suspicious activity, and people, it makes me so angry even just reading this out loud, because what if it said something like, you're in an area of extreme heat. If you see people with backpacks and water bottles, maybe you should find out if they're okay. So there's certain choices that are being made in the language, in the audience. Again, another layer of the control of movement. This is a rescue beacon not far from where we are. So Border Patrol always points to these rescue beacons as what they're doing to save lives in the landscape. This rescue beacon, it's about 25 feet tall. In contrast, this is the Elgin, just a couple miles away, Elgin Security Tower, Surveillance Tower. You can't even get the scope of it in the same lens, so that's the height. So once again, we can kind of see the priorities, and we can see stacked functions in terms of control and violence in the borderlands. This is Brad Jones, who I was with that day. We walked right up on a water tank that had just been emptied by vigilantes. So very recently, the water hadn't even absorbed yet. So vigilantes, as you could maybe look at as another layer of the violence and control on the border. And of course, Border Patrol has been caught on camera dumping and slashing water bottles in the same landscape. I am over time, but just to note that if we're going to kind of extend this lens, we also have to keep in mind the long, ongoing history of the revolving door kind of use and exploitation of undocumented Latin American labor. So long history there. Long history of land dispossession, all the way back to colonial time from indigenous people. The United States then interfering, often through the likes of companies like United Fruit Company, in the land tenure and traditional methods that people could survive on the landscape, even going so far as to overthrow democratically elected presidents and install military dictatorships. So this is not, once again, we have to look at the flow of people coming this way, coming to the United States, coming through this landscape as one deeply embedded in a violent history. That, again, that's a different lens that we can take historically to kind of situate what we're seeing today. In closing, I have to mention the human costs in detail. More than 3,000 deaths just in the Arizona portion of the US-Mexico border. About 1,000 of these are still unidentified. So you have families looking just to see what that strategy did in terms of human lives. This is 1999, that's when that 94 strategy went into effect. So I took on way too much today, I apologize, but it's a pleasure to hear all of you speak, and I'm looking forward to talking with you more. Thank you.
Let's see. All right, it's still good morning, so good morning, everyone. I'm just gonna set a little timer on here if I can figure this thing out. So thank you all for being here. Really excited to see a lot of people, especially that I don't recognize. So I think we are being successful in bringing some different groups of people together. So my name is Arlie Adkins. I'm an assistant professor of urban planning at Capella here at the University of Arizona. And I'm going to be talking to you today about several projects that I've been working on over the last 5 or 6 years. A little bit of background. So I came out of my PhD program armed with more classes in advanced statistics than I can count on one hand. However, the more I started using some of those techniques and getting into the amazing data that we have available for a lot of urban questions, the more I realized some of the limitations. And I've taken kind of a different tack over the last several years, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. So this topic of community knowledge in this era of big data. So what is community knowledge? Just very briefly. Community knowledge is based on people's collective experiences. This is fairly straightforward. Understanding how communities view the places that they live, and understanding the inherent value that comes with that way of knowing in these communities. So locally produced, context-specific
It can be combined with professional and scientific knowledge to inform and make more legitimate and lasting the decisions that we make as urban planners and other decision makers related to the built environment. Using community knowledge, of course, takes specific engagement and research strategies, and it's not easy to do. And as you'll see, some of the things that we have been doing. And this may explain why we don't always see this incorporated into some of the important research that we're seeing around cities. So my research question, very broadly over the last 5 years, has been what makes a place walkable? And in my field of urban planning, this is one of the, in some ways, one of the more researched topics that you can find. So how do things like the built environment impact decisions people make about transportation, with walking being one of those decisions or those modes of transportation that I'm particularly interested in. So we have some really good answers here around this question. Since the 1990s, and this is actually the first Google image that comes up when you Google 1990s, or at least for my Google algorithm, so maybe that says something. But we've literally seen hundreds of studies on this topic of built environment, travel behavior, with a lot of the focus on walking. So several years ago, I published with some co-authors a systematic review of about 30 of these studies that allowed us to look at differences by different groups of people. So one of the limitations that we identified in that review is that the early research in this in the 1990s was really focused on establishing these sort of baseline relationships. And they intentionally, in order to kind of make the case to decision makers, policy makers, they statistically controlled for, or they just selected cases that kind of did away with variation. So they were able to tell us a lot about the relationships between built environment and travel for, frankly, groups that looked a lot like the people in this picture, probably from slightly lower income zip codes. But nonetheless, we had a very narrow picture, and we've seen that replicated in study after study, even as our techniques have gotten much more advanced. And we're still seeing just huge amounts of research in this topic that's really replicating some of these same blind spots. So I want to talk about three projects that I've been working on, part of a multi-year research project funded by the CDC and by the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. So those are, one, the systematic review that I mentioned, so a qualitative investigation here in Tucson about barriers to walking, and an earlier study that kind of launched some of this work for me on racial bias in stopping behavior at crosswalks. So the systematic review, don't pay attention to the details of this table, but what we were able to do by selecting the studies that did allow for a comparison between some sort of socioeconomically advantaged group and a disadvantaged group. So as you can see here, some of them were based on race, some of them based on income. What we found is that the effect of a built environment on whether or not someone was walking or getting enough physical activity was 2.6 times stronger for the relatively advantaged group than for the relatively disadvantaged group. So think about this for a second in terms of, if we're talking about the health benefits of living in a walkable community, which there are reams of research on coming from the public health side of things, if we had some sort of medication that we gave someone that was 2.6 times stronger for white, wealthier people than for people who couldn't be described that way, we would see that as a major problem with that medication. So similarly, we need to be thinking more broadly about how we define and how we look at this question. So a couple of questions that this raises: is walkability just less important to some people? So these traditional measures that we've come up with, are people just not reacting to them the same way? I think a more important question is, are we measuring this incorrectly in certain contexts? And based on some of the further digging we've done, we think that it's more this latter question that's important. So here is just a paper if you want to read more about this. This is in the Journal of the American Planning Association. So the second project, looking at barriers to walking and physical activity in Tucson. This was an extension of that CDC-funded work. We went out and talked to people. We did 190 interviews with pedestrians on the street here in Tucson. Half of those interviews, roughly, were in predominantly Hispanic Latino parts of Tucson, and half were in non-Hispanic white parts of Tucson, predominantly. We trained grad students and sent community partners out. We partnered with Living Streets Alliance on this, for those of you familiar with that organization. And we had some very open-ended questions for people, essentially asking them what they like and don't like about walking in their communities. So some of the results from that, skipping right ahead, I think you can all hopefully read that. But these, from 190 interviews, this first cut at the results, when I show this to groups of transportation planners, they nod along and say, yeah, these are the things that are important. These are the things that we put into our policies and our decision making about walkability, so you can kind of see the distribution there. However, there's a bit of a trick here. This is only in the white, non-Hispanic areas. So we see different patterns when we ask the same questions of people walking in Hispanic, Latino, mostly Mexican American areas of Tucson. So what we see generally is that some of the social elements of the neighborhood are coming to the fore. And this is very significant because these are very brief conversations we're having with people. So these were not, sitting down and prompting them to talk about these things. These were things that came to the surface in a probably 2 to 4 minute conversation, sometimes less. So quite striking in terms of what stood out here. So both in terms of positive and negative contributors to walkability, we see very large differences. We're now in the process, we've replicated this, or we've done the same mode of data collection in Los Angeles, Orange County, and Denver, Colorado. So we're now going through, seeing some different patterns, but some of the same things emerging as well. Again, a paper, if you want to read more about this, in the Journal of Transport and Health. And then backing up to a project that I actually began with a colleague of mine in my PhD program, looking at an experimental study of whether drivers exhibit signs of implicit racial bias when deciding whether or not to stop for pedestrians at crosswalks. So we worked with a social psychologist to set up an experiment where we hired people to cross the street all day. We had 3 black men, 3 white men, similar builds. We dressed them the same. We actually trained them how to approach the crosswalk so that we were trying to, again, control for some of those things that might be different. And we did see a significant difference. This was a study that we did in Portland, Oregon. And we saw, if I'm remembering correctly, because this was a while ago, the black pedestrians had to wait about twice as long, and they were, I think, passed by 3 times as many cars. So Portland is a place where drivers tend to stop for pedestrians at crosswalks. So the amount of time was not that huge, but we did see a significant difference. We've talked about replicating this study in Tucson. There's a big problem. Nobody stops for anyone at crosswalks in Tucson, so we calculated we'd have to do many, many thousands of trials to get enough data to find the variance. So these results, thanks to UA News and the great communications people here, made quite a splash. This is probably 4 years ago. So we got some great press coverage about this, I think because the finding is well suited to headlines. Something I'm particularly excited about, so Nick Kristof in his New York Times column wrote about this in the lead up to the 2016 election, talking about kind of race in American society today. And one of my greater quotes, this was from a Dutch newspaper, and somehow I'm quoted in Dutch, which is kind of fun. Or actually, I believe it's Flemish, actually, not Dutch, so similar, but. So then we also, after that research project in Portland, we decided we wanted to do some follow-up focus groups to talk to Black pedestrians about their experiences walking in Portland. And so here I just want to share a little bit of what we found there. And one of the things about community knowledge is that the language is not always the nicest. Community knowledge contains 4-letter words, so prepare yourselves. But I'm not going to read these out loud, but I think you can all see them to read, so I'm just going to go through them. But this was a person talking about how they really hadn't thought about this, but on reflection in the focus group, realized that when they were out previously walking with a white partner, cars did stop. And how that kind of made them feel upon some prompting. And just these ways that people talk about these issues in their lives, I think can be really, really striking. So this mention of feeling like she could breathe because someone was there to take some of this burden away, I think is really a profound thing that we would not get through other modes of data collection. And then here, somebody actually brought up the study because it did make some local news, so people were aware of it in the focus group sometimes. But I think this really brings home the point that we need to be listening to people, that sometimes just asking people, whether it's going out on the street or going to where people live, and asking them about their lives and how they interact with the built environment can be really critical and profound. So we have actually developed a data collection toolkit as part of this CDC grant. We have done we did sort of a soft launch this fall. In February, we're going to be doing a training on this, and we'll have more materials available on the website, but that is at qped.org for the Qualitative Pedestrian Environments Data Toolkit. So something to keep an eye out for. Again, we think that this can be a really good supplement to other modes of inquiry that are being used out there. So in closing, some of you probably recognize what this is. This is a backup camera in my car, and I think it has a really important message on it. Never rely solely on the camera system. Never rely solely on one mode of looking at things. When we're talking about urban systems, when we're talking about people's lives, they're very complex, and we need to understand those from different angles. So my big lessons, I think, for this whole idea of RESTRUCT is addressing complex urban problems and solutions requires multiple types of knowledge. It's never about the built environment alone. There's always a larger context that we need to understand. Even if our jobs are specifically focused on the built environment, we will make mistakes and we will do the wrong thing if we don't understand that larger context. Small data is sometimes needed to understand the big data. And consequences of getting it wrong, of making assumptions, of misinterpreting data can be very serious, especially for the most vulnerable. Thank you. And I think we'll do questions later, right?
So the title of my talk is Art and Culture as Community Development in Immigrant Neighborhoods, the case of Little Tokyo and Los Angeles. Also, sorry, I'm kind of like turning around to look at this thing. I didn't bring my laptop to hold in front of me. So basically, I'm kind of going to end with a little dessert, you might say. This is a more sort of positive tale of thinking about spatial justice, a kind of rare case in which a number of factors kind of played a role in seeing kind of a positive outcome occur. So Little Tokyo is a historically Japanese-American neighborhood in Los Angeles. It's in the downtown area, sort of nestled between the Civic Center and the now kind of completely gentrified Arts District. So it's a relatively tiny area. It's only a few city blocks, but seeing immense sort of gentrification pressures because of its surroundings. And part of the reason, of course, why it is so small is that it's seen a long history of challenges over its existence. So, like many immigrant neighborhoods, there was redlining, racial discrimination. Perhaps most significantly, during World War II, the entire neighborhood was literally and physically uprooted during their forced incarceration of Japanese Americans. And so that was extremely significant. Immediately upon the return to the neighborhood, a large portion of the neighborhood was seized through eminent domain by the city of Los Angeles to build the infamous Parker Center, the LAPD headquarters, which was recently torn down, a site of a lot of sort of racial kind of animus over the years. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a large influx of foreign capital into the neighborhood, largely from Japan, but sort of large corporations wanted to invest, and people who were there found it very difficult to kind of contend with those forces. And then finally, we have our kind of current period of gentrification unfolding in the neighborhood. So, there's a lot going on. It's sort of confounding that the neighborhood would even exist at all, given all of these challenges. And so that was sort of my research question, like how did this happen? And I sort of came up with this term civic expression to identify and define and describe, I think, one of the key factors that played a role in how this community was able to remain sort of socially cohesive and actually expand and develop its own sort of built environment in the neighborhood. I describe this as the public manifestations of culture which demonstrate the political desires of a community. There are a number of basically sort of cultural manifestations, both sort of temporal but also physical in the form of architecture and other pieces of the built environment that allowed the community to continue to exist. And I kind of classify them. I'm just showing sort of a little piece of archival work that I did in looking at this. I kind of classify them into 4 periods. You have kind of the immediate period after the return to the community from forced incarceration after World War II, a kind of new generation of arts activists that came up in the 1960s and 70s, a sort of kind of second generation Japanese Americans, actually third generation really. A specific way in which the community was able to kind of identify the challenge of the influx of foreign capital and kind of channel that into community resources and through cultural institution building in the community. And so that's sort of how that challenge was met. And finally, a kind of new use of arts as a form of community organizing and activism to sort of shape the way in which community development and urban development was playing out in this kind of current period of gentrification. So let's see, where am I at? How much longer do I have? Oh, 1 minute, okay. So I'm just gonna show some sort of images from this. I love this image. This is a picture of the Nisei Week Festival. This is an incredible image because this is immediately after the return from forced incarceration, and already you have this very sort of profound public display of ethnic identity, which I think is really incredible and brave and kind of a demonstration of the way in which culture is sort of building and bringing together a community in space. This is the team of visual communications, kind of Asian American multimedia organization that took a lot of images and photos in the community, including things like sort of protest actions, and they're really using arts and media to kind of congeal a political consciousness, including kind of intergenerational activities. This is this sort of third period of institution building, and sort of building institutions like the Japanese American Community and Cultural Center, the Japanese American National Museum, and a number of other institutions, sort of, again, channeling that influx of foreign capital into these entities that didn't necessarily shift the ownership of the community into external communities, but actually kind of held that within. And finally, there's this sort of very interesting and exciting coalition of many of those institutions that were built in the 80s and 90s under the name Sustainable Little Tokyo, which is really trying to, they've sort of collectively identified 3 publicly owned large parcels of land, the last remaining available land in Little Tokyo, to really kind of collectively stake a claim over that land, and because it's publicly owned, sort of using art as a form of organizing and activism, you can actually sort of pressure the city to give some control over the future of that land to the community. And so that's sort of how that is unfolding. And so I'll kind of leave that there as one sort of positive example of the way in which sort of thinking about community development and really even building new physical infrastructure can be sort of guided and organized by communities through the sort of kind of intentional and creative use of culture. And so with that, I might ask our four panelists to come up to the front here, and we can maybe like have a bit of a conversation with the remaining 15 minutes of our session. Grab a chair. Yeah. Cool. Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, questions, thoughts, ideas, reactions, and we have this mic, which I think we can maybe pass around.
I feel like we're in the gladiator.
Yeah, exactly. Who will survive? Oh, yeah.
Is it on? Okay. This is a question for Robin, or a comment first and then a question. I've taught a course called Landscapes of War several times, and so I found myself really appreciating the clarity and directness of your language, because so many of the structures you showed that are meant to be impediments to movement or instruments of surveillance absolutely come from the toolkit of warfare. I mean, it's that direct a connection. So I think putting that name on it is appropriate. My question is whether, so you were looking at things right at the border, but I wonder whether you or colleagues are mapping the larger field of this warfare, including things like detention centers, and because I'm just wondering about the degree to which we weaponize our own territory in that extended field, and so I was curious about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I meant to mention that one of the materials used for the wall was actually Vietnam-era landing strips, and they were recycled. So they've been mostly replaced by the bollard wall now, but they also used to cause, they were very sharp at the top. But there's a lot of crossover, and there's a reason why Center for Low Intensity Conflict was brought in to design concurrent strategies on the border. So the border forensics project that I'm building is very, very new, so I would love to talk with you. Right now, the way that I'm envisioning it is a little bit geographically precise in terms of the Arizona Sonoran Desert, and trying to use a geographical boundary making tool that's not a political one, but a natural one. So playing around with that, but there's certainly detention centers in that space. So right now I'm writing grants to bring together people who are interested in having these conversations about, what types of expertise do we want to bring around the table, what types of evidence do we want to collect, and where do we see that evidence then being presented, whether in a public forum or actually a legal one. So right now I have some human rights lawyers who are also helping with the project, but it's super early stage. So to answer your question about detention centers, yes, absolutely, and looking at the space and the ways in which people are controlled within those smaller spaces is going to be really important.
And just an offer, I think those of us in the School of Architecture could supply some tools to you for the visualization of these structures and movements that you're studying. And your photographs were incredible and did a great job, but there are also some graphic techniques that are really helpful.
Other questions or thoughts? Yeah. Thanks. This question is for Arlie. I thought that the presentation was really fascinating, and the perceptions of walkability across different racial and ethnic groups. I was wondering about what that looks like across genders, and how women travel and perceive safety and other matters.
Great question. So we did do a little bit of looking into this, and it's not what we expected. There weren't as many clear distinctions, and also, and I don't know what I was basing this on, but in terms of sort of the importance of social elements related to perceptions of walkability, we saw that things like community identity and supportive social networks were, if anything, more frequently mentioned by men, which surprised me. So definitely more need to study that particular question, but I think it's a good one.
Actually, this is also a question for Arlie. So you did the survey about pedestrians on the street. They are walking. And so I wonder the perceptions might be different for people who are not on the streets. You know, people like me, I don't work in the neighborhood at all. So I may not notice the facilities, the availability on sidewalk. So I wonder, whether you did similar things for this.
Yeah, so we are about to launch a survey of households in these same neighborhoods to compare the results, because it is certainly a limitation of this method, is that we're only talking to people who are out walking for some people. So we do think, and again, back to this kind of community knowledge perspective, that those are the real experts when it comes to understanding the walkability of the neighborhood. But that's not to say that there aren't people that are prevented from walking for some reason that we may want to understand. So that is the next step.
I have a question for Vlad, and that's, I guess in your opinion, or in your informed opinion, how is the city of Tucson doing when it comes to planning for extreme heat, and perhaps how could the city better plan for extreme heat?
Sorry,
You got it now.
I have to be careful because we have the city staff in the back. No, I think so I've worked with a lot of cities on this and I've done interviews across the Southwest and across the country, and I'll know more after our survey is done, because we're truly reaching out nationwide to cities. I would say from the interviews that we've done so far, though, I think at first glance, planners in the Southwest typically say, well, it's already hot, so of course we plan for it. And they're kind of like just dismiss it like, yeah, it's hot, we plan for it. And then you kind of go a little bit deeper and you say, okay, what are you doing specifically? And then they kind of realize, well, there's things that we are doing that we're not articulating very well. So most of the playgrounds in Tucson now are covered with shade structures. So that's something that's kind of become commonplace here that other cities don't do, they're looking at doing. So those things we're not really articulating as a heat adaptive strategy though. But then there's lots of other stuff that we probably should be doing that we're just starting to look at now. So it's kind of a case of we've been doing some stuff for a while and we're not articulating it as well as we could. And then a case that as the climate gets hotter and as it rises as an issue that we care about, I think we're going to look more specifically at how to use public money to combat that. So I know the city is looking at potentially a climate action plan. We have a new comp plan coming up. And then I've been working with the Pima County Health Department, and they're doing the Pima County Health Plan for crime resilience too. So certainly everyone I've talked to kind of in the right places are thinking in the right directions, and so I would say everyone's moving in the right direction. So that's a good question.
So this is a question for all of you. Thinking about the RESTRUCT Built Environment Research Initiative, what are the suggestions you have based on your experience working with communities about what's important for the initiative as a whole to engage communities, and the conversation about community knowledge, and you talked about Tessa talked about the use of the heat maps and those types of things. Just wondering from anybody who wants to answer, what are some key strategies that you think are ways for the initiative to make sure that we're engaging the community?
Arlie's jumping around a lot. I'll start off and I'll just say that I think for those of us in planning and the social sciences, these are new techniques to work with communities. So a lot of us have been doing this type of work for a long time, and there's a lot of research built around kind of appropriately working with communities to advance knowledge. So I think starting from that base and using the people that I would say working with the researchers who are interfaced with those communities already would be probably a good place to start. And it's not like the university has to do that since it was from a great institution. And I think the other thing is there is a lot of interdisciplinary work, so maybe, hopefully, one thing that will come out of this RESTRUCT symposium is kind of highlighting some of the ways that we're already working with public health officials, or myself, I work a lot with climate politics and things like climate science. So I think kind of highlighting some of the great work that's already going on.
Just real briefly, leaving room for the critical. So restruct, rebuild, it's exciting, and I think it's a great reminder for social scientists like myself who would just love to describe the problem, to be challenged, to envision. With that said, I have a little bit of a struggle fitting in a social, a critical anthropology lens, because it, right now a lot of the language emphasizes the building. So I think, one of the important things for the university is always going to be listening. And if we're building something that's so much around building that it doesn't have that like listening, critical thinking, critical history lens, that can be an accidental way of like leaving out community voices that have something to share about how the space is not welcoming to them, how they feel alienated by the university, and those sorts of making sure that we leave room to look at the problem too.
So yeah, important question. And one of the things about community knowledge is that it has a very long memory, and we're often working in places that have been restructured a lot, and not always in ways that have benefited the communities. So echoing that need for sort of a critical approach and perspective.
So I might sort of wrap us up. I think we're at time. But I think that's a really appropriate question to end on, and I would just echo everything that's said. I think that's part of the reason why, in the intro, I really saw our grand challenge as one that really must be integrated into all the other grand challenges, because it should be a question in all the work that we do. And to echo Arlie's point as well, I think we have to accept, even in kind of approaching a grand challenge that by its definition is really kind of transforming, everything, that especially, as we undertake specific projects and sort of work with specific communities, it actually is important to kind of describe some limits so that we can invest and set up long-term relationships with places, rather than do what so often can be damaging when researchers kind of pop in for a quick visit, have a finding, get a publication, and leave. But setting up some of these longer-term relationships are really important. So with that, I thank everyone for joining us, and I think we can continue the conversation over lunch.